fortunate to have Ivan Porto Carrero, and he's going to tell us all about Swagger.io. We have 33 minutes, so use it well, and you can ask questions. I believe it's very interactive, and Ivan is going to tell you about himself. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Ivan, and I work for VMware on the cloud native team. Prior to this, I used lots of Scala, and I wrote Scalatra, which was a web framework in the Scala community. Then I started working at Reverb, and these are the people who kind of invented Swagger. So who of you is familiar with Swagger, what it does or what it doesn't do, or what it's good for? At the end of this talk, I hope you all know what Swagger is about and why you want to use this stuff. And then I contributed the async Scala async client to work with Swagger APIs. After that, I got really bored with Scala because it's a very complex language, and people started fighting the entire time in the community. So I moved on to Go, which is what my talk will be in. If I show code, it will be in Go. But if you're not familiar with Go, it's as close as it gets to pseudo code possible. So Swagger, it comes from a problem we had when we started doing microservices like about 6-7 years ago, and all of these things started evolving relatively fast with different teams having to talk to each other and all that stuff. So when you end up doing microservices, you end up with a bunch of problems, right? So the first problem is that there is almost no documentation. And other people that you collaborate with, they have to go read the source code to find out which parameters they can send and all of that stuff. You don't like reading somebody else's source code or a language you're not familiar with at all. So if you're a front-end person, you're not familiar with Java, it's not a very fun experience to go through all of that stuff. And so documentation is a big problem here. At any given time, if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me, right? The idea is that this becomes more like a conversation instead of me like throwing things down. A second problem that exists is once people get to the point where they have to document APIs, the documentation gets stale, right? So that's probably even worse than having to read source code, because now you think you're looking at something, but it's a complete fantasy, right? So that's also not that awesome, right? So next problem that appears is, okay, so we gotta communicate lots and lots of things. So now we're in like meetings and meetings and meetings about having less meetings and more meetings about those subjects. It gets into this whole like unhappy place, right? And then I think if you're a front-end engineer, this particular bit becomes very familiar because you have to wait on the backend people to deliver those new APIs, and they're just way too slow, and you're going to miss your deadline, and in the end you've got 2 days to deliver whatever you have done, while the backend team took 3 weeks to get their stuff done. So that's also not an awesome place to be. And then you get your stuff to your customers. You got an API. Now your customers have to write your SDK, because these people, they use Erlang, and you've written everything in Java or in Go or in Node.js, and they're totally not so happy with you, right? Especially if you have like APIs with thousands of endpoints and 20,000 types, as my employer does. And so all too often, that ends up in conflicts. People are blaming each other. There's all of these safeguards. People start building walls around their thing. It becomes this cover your ass policy game. And that's also not a very fun place to be, right? So what do we want, right? Humans want up-to-date documentation to read. That was our idea. We want to look at something, and it needs to look kind of pretty. And I have to be able to read it, not interpret it. The consumers, so this is about like other code things, they want an exhaustive contract. They want something that describes all the rules of inputs and outputs that go into your web service. And then you have to support different programming languages. So when I was at Reverb, most of the backend was using Scala, the front end was using either Objective-C, HTML5, and JavaScript, and some people used Haskell. And so another thing that would be very nice to have is once you've got hundreds of services deployed is how do I discover what is available already and how can I reuse some of these models that other people have defined and all of that stuff. So getting to a place where I can do reflection over my infrastructure would be a very nice thing to have, right? And then how do I not having to repeat myself? So if I've got a user kind of object, how can I share that user object across all of those applications that are written in different languages? So I can't just make a shared library of something. I need to make a shared code generation kind of path. Right? So from all of this, I think the contract part is probably one of the more important pieces of it. So there is more sadness at this stage because we're doing all of these APIs, but we kind of have prehistoric tooling at this stage, right? So we don't really know what's going on in our infrastructure. Distributed systems are really hard to debug, and all of that stuff is just not a fun place to be. So Swagger is here. Yeah. And it's an open standard on the Linux Foundation. It's an interface to your service described in JSON, which is language neutral, right? It's a language and platform and deployment agnostic way of describing what your service does. It describes inputs and outputs. It enables bigotry-free because if you read these blog posts about REST, everybody gets up on their high horse and they're like, REST should only be done this way. And then you go to the next blog post, it says the opposite, right? So it's a little bit annoying. So let's just get things done. That was our idea. And then it needs to be machine readable. So that machines can also make judgments and you can apply certain decisions based on the metadata that something exposes. And it needs to be controlled by the server because the server is what's serving your API. So ideally, all of this comes straight out of your code base. So tooling is important. And what I've built for Go is a toolkit that does a validation of Swagger specs. So these Swagger specs can get really large. Some of these people, like somebody sent me the Swagger spec for Bitbucket, and I'd never seen a 20,000 or 30,000 line JSON document that a human had created. They've done this. And there were mistakes in there. So with validations and stuff and putting a validator, it was much easier to figure out where to make some changes in that spec so that it became valid. The next part is we should be able to generate clients. Ideally, also generate a server so that you don't have to write all of that stuff, because if you've ever done an HTTP API, lots of it is very boring, boilerplate stuff. You go like, oh, this thing needs to have a name. This name needs to be at least 1 char long. It needs to be just like, only these chars can be in my username. You do all these validation rules. They're relatively boring. You get them wrong half the time because Boolean logic seems to be very hard, at least for me. And so the next part is for Go in particular, because Go is this very fragmented. There is a new web framework in Go every day, pretty much. And they all do the same thing. They serve web APIs, but they have one different idea. And so I wanted it to work with any Go application in this case. So I made this syntax that works in documentation or in code comments. And the documentation has to live with your code. Go has this generate thing. How many of you are familiar with Go and the shortcomings of Go? Go is like a language without a type system. It has nothing. It has if, then, else, for, and we're done. And And then it has no generics. So to do generics, people do all this code generation stuff. To do that, the Go authors came up with this Go generate thing that you can add to your documents and then to your code files, and it will generate code for you. Yeah, it's a lot like programming in the 70s. So the SDKs that this tool generates are statically typed. They are regenerated on each import. When we did it for the first time, our front-end teams started becoming a lot more happy because they could keep moving, and the backend could keep changing their models, right? Every time the spec updated, the iOS team in particular was very happy about this. JavaScript is very dynamic, so it kind of adapts all the time. But the iOS people, they were super happy when we put property ordering in place and all that stuff, and so we could keep moving. There was a lot of business value in this particular thing, because we were no longer having meetings about having less meetings, but instead we had meetings about our APIs. Swagger Cogen is another project that is from under the Swagger API org on GitHub, and that has support for 30 plus languages. So if you can produce a valid JSON document, you've got client SDKs for about 30 languages out of the box. So for a server, the Swagger specification document, I'll show you some actual things later on that are not just bullet points on a slide. The Swagger specification remains a source of truth. The first time I went into a design meeting that used Swagger was very weird, because it was the very first time for me as well to experience that. I went into this meeting, and during this meeting we built up this YAML document, and we walked out of the meeting and we generated code, and we were working. We were implementing our API, right? So we went from zero to coding in about half an hour. And the servers that are generated, they provide you with routing, they provide you with security, so they provide you with authentication, authorization stuff. They provide you with request validation. And in this case, if you're not familiar with Go, the last thing is just not important. And so the idea is that with those generated servers, you just fill in the blanks. You just fill in the things that matter to you, that matter to your business. And so I'm gonna skip these things, and I'll just get into some actual coding instead. Right? That's probably more interesting. Oh, let me get to the actual. There's a bunch of tools that work with Swagger out of the box. So Postman. You're familiar with Postman? You've used this before, right? So you can point Postman at the Swagger API, and immediately you can start making requests to it. Postman will update and will create fields and stuff like that for that. There is SOAP UI. Is the people who kind of own the Swagger organization at this particular time. And then there is a Node.js project, comment car. You can point that at any Swagger enabled server, and you have a CLI to this server. So let's go. I want to show you the Swagger Hub, which is a collaboration space where you can put your Swagger specs and you can discuss things. And with that, I get into the code samples, if I ever find this again. Okay, so it does scroll. So a Swagger spec is something that you can express. So what we've done is we said YAML is for human beings, JSON is for machines. Nobody wants to quote arguments the entire time and adhere to these things. And so what we've said is a Swagger specification can be expressed in YAML. What you're gonna provide is you provide some information about your API. Yes. I'm going to try.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to show what renders, but yeah. Okay, so, and then you're going to say, oh, my API can do JSON, right? So you specify a MIME type, and it's gonna also give people JSON back. The next part that you're defining is my API is going to be HTTP or is going to be HTTPS, so that people know how to talk to your API. And then you're going to define a bunch of paths. So you're going to say, hey, at the root in this case. So I'm going to use, as an example, I'm going to use a to-do list application because I think everybody is kind of familiar with what a to-do list is. You give it some text and then you flag yes or no, I'm done or not done, right? And so in my to-do, in this first version, it's only going to list to-dos, basically. And so what you see then is we define a path, we define a method. The tag is more to namespace it. And then I'm going to give it a name, find to-dos. So when code generation tools tend to use this field as the method name for the client, yes?
So is this example you're giving based on an idea that you haven't written any code yet and you're just designing the contract up front?
Yeah.
Because you want to generate it?
Yeah, we're in a design meeting at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to do a to-do list application. Sorry?
Operation ID, in this case, like your method name, right?
Yeah, it's going to turn into a method name for, they should be unique too, in a full document. And then you're going to say, oh, well, I'm probably going to want to like filter my to-do list at some point based on a date and a limit. So I only want to return like 20 items at a time so I can do paging to it. So you provide these two parameters. You can provide more stuff. You can provide headers and all of that stuff. So you define a comprehensive contract for your service so that people always know what goes in and out. And then you're going to say, oh, yeah, so when everything's OK, I'm going to do a 200 response. And in this 200 response, I'm going to list all the to-do items. To do so, I'm going to return an array, and that array is going to have items. So everything else is going to be an error, and so I'm going to return an error for these things. So the schema uses JSON schema. It's a very well defined, or maybe not well defined, but it's a relatively common way to describe JSON data with validations and stuff. And then so we end up in the actual definitions, so the models that the API returns. An item, I've said, is an object. At minimum, I require a description for this thing. I've got an ID in there because it's going to be stored in a database. Probably this ID is read-only so that it's auto-generated on the server side. Description needs to be at least one length, one char long. Wouldn't say much about what's to do, but and whether or not it's completed, which is a Boolean. An error, similar. An error contains a code so that you can attach internationalization or localization, and it's got a default message. Okay, so the Swagger hub then renders this thing. In this case, it's not super. I don't know many words. I don't write many things. So I didn't put a long description here. I can find you, if you're interested, I can find you a nicer one that has a lot more documentation, like the Instagram API. And then it's going to render a representation of your API, right? So that other people, other teams can use your Swagger spec, put it in here, and they can read proper what is in there. Which again shows you the same things. For 200, we're going to list the to-do operations. It's got a schema that it describes here, just the same. The star means it's required. And then you got an error. So when I'm not going to generate code because every time I do a demo, things just go really, really bad. So I've pre-generated code. Yeah.
That gives us a lot of trouble.
I can do it if you want, like, yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll just go and do all of it. I'll compile. I'm really like tempted, or at least defying the demo gods here. Okay, so I've got a Swagger spic in here. That Swagger spic is going to show, if I show what's in there, you're going to see it's got, is this large enough, this text? So it shows the same things we were just looking at. It's the same spic. I just pasted it in there. And then I'm going to do Swagger generate server. And, if Swagger YAML. Oh, yeah, it does this thing. I need to be in the Go path. Go is very opinionated about where you put your files. And so I had to move it to the Go path thing. Let's see if it does it now. Swagger generate. So after this, it does this thing. It parses my spec. It builds up a plan. Then it renders some models. The error in the item, it's going to render the method. So the operation ID was find to do's. So that means it appears here. I can make this bigger. It appears here as find to do's. Then it's going to render the parameters for it to do, because all of this validation needs to happen. It's going to give me a bunch of responses, and it's going to embed the Swagger template. That was a feature request from some company. And what's in there? Yeah, let's do Atom. My Atom is pre-configured for presentations. If it ever shows up. Atom is very slow. I don't know if you have the same problem with it. It just takes forever. Okay, so again, we have the same specification document. And then it generated a server. Oh, yeah. Okay. It generated a server for us. That server is gonna serve the API basically. There's some hooks to configure the server. So in here, it generates this configure file. In there, it's going to say, hey, it was a JSON API. I need something to serialize JSON. I need something to deserialize JSON. And there is one method. You should really implement this method. At this moment, it says it's not implemented. And there's the ability to add middlewares, I think, for everybody making REST APIs. Every framework in every language allows you to put some middlewares in there. So Swagger could not be left behind. What's probably more interesting is you'll see that it generates this code to handle requests, where it's going to bind and validate the request set of parameters. And then it's going to, if there were errors, it's going to say, hey, I was very unhappy with this. Please try again or something. And otherwise, it's going to actually handle the request. So when you see you see parameters here, you'll see that when it goes and binds the limit had validations, right? Yeah, it's gonna look if it was provided. If not, it's gonna set the default value, and it's gonna convert whatever you put in there as string into a number and stuff like that. Since very similar story. Because all of this is very boilerplatey, right? So you don't have to deal with this boilerplate anymore. It just did the boilerplate in about a second. So that saves you about a day of work. What is more interesting probably is looking at an actual example of this. So I'm going to close this guy. You've seen I can generate code, it does all these things. We can expand on this spec. So once it's not very useful just listing APIs, just listing to-dos. So another specification would then be, hey, I want to create to-dos. When you create something, you want to return 201, which is the status code for created. And you kind of want to be able to update some of these things. So you specify a path parameter here of ID. And you describe this thing. It's an int64, and it has to be present. You do a put, because wholesale replacement is so much easier. And eventually you also want to delete these things, so you can define a delete method. Similar, you're going to return no content when everything went okay. You're all familiar, right? With the 200 code, everything's great. And everything else is kind of the same, so I'm still building on top of that same spec. We had a second meeting now, right? We had a second design meeting at this point in time. We walked out of that meeting, we regenerated code, and this then ends up in, how do I hide? Okay. In this file. So this file contains an actual implementation with an in-memory database, or what passes for the database, a map of all the to-dos that would be created. So as simple as, this is as simple as I can make it, at least, yeah. It still does concurrent access because it's the web, right? So things can talk to things at the same time. And it fetches things, it adheres to all the limit and stuff like that. When you set it up, you attach a handler to one of the methods. This is based on top of the operation ID and the tag. And then you return your result values. Does this work? That's the big question of today, I guess.
Are you going to run it to show us?
I'll run it, yeah. 3 minutes? Okay. Yeah, I'll run it to show. Yeah.
What if you wanted to do it the other way? You want to do code first? Can you like annotate your code and generate the spec?
Yeah, totally possible. So in this generated code, I didn't show that. So in this generated code, these operations. Not this guy, that's just lots and lots of code, that doesn't matter much. But this guy here is annotated, right? So I got the add one, and then it's annotated with Swagger route post method. This is the path, the tag, and the operation ID. Some documentation that you write in your documentation comment. So even if you were to serve this up through the Go documentation server, it would still kind of look okay for humans to read. It looks better in the Swagger UI. Then the models, they are not really annotated. Yeah, in this case, it is annotated because it's a different name. It's a lowercase item versus an uppercase in Go. It would kind of discover these things, and you point the Swagger generate. You would do Swagger generate spec. You point it to that main file, and it then generates a spec file out of your code. If you write Node or something, you've got a different way of doing this. There's a project from Apigee called Sway. I believe they work around a similar model. And then there is a company in Austin, Stoplight.io. It's a very, very pretty website. And they have a very interesting take on this because they're like, yeah, so you just make your API and then you send it stuff. And it's going to build up, let's see if it's got here, this Prism API proxy, which is built on top of Go Swagger. That's how I know about it. So what they do is you serve your API, you send it data, and it's just going to build a spec as you send it requests. And that's another approach to this. Obviously, you won't get the validation rules, but it gets you started, right? It's a nice approach to all of this. Yeah, so I'll skip the demo. I'll skip trying to send requests to it. I know it works because I did it just outside. And so I can do like the code is generated allows you to specify a port so that you can basically, the idea was that if you generate code and you want to push it to a Roku, it should just work. And that's what happens here. That's why it's got this port environment variable so that a Roku would be happy with it. And then I'm gonna HTTP. Yeah, so I made this mistake of requiring this very custom content type. If I do HTTP 127, there's no place like home. Then it's just very unhappy, right? If I show it here, you'll see it just this means Go is very unhappy with things. Once I do this, it's going to show us an empty list. If I then do HTTP post, so now I got a to-do list. I've got to present at this conference here. Let's see if that made it in. So if I then make the same request from earlier, which was empty here, I now have a thing. What happens if I do an empty description? So it's all the way at the bottom. I've got an empty description. If I hit empty description, it's going to tell me, hey, you should give me something. So we've got validation going. And that's about it.